thanks to all of you for joining today, and happy Earth Day. This is an important day to really take stock of what we can all do to make the planet a better place, not just for all of the animals that are out there and the ecologies that we work on, but for also all the people that are on this planet. So today, though, I'm going to focus down a bit. I'm going to focus on insects and other invertebrates. And I'm going to talk about what some people are calling the insect apocalypse, and what's really happening, why you should care about it. But really, the lion's share at the end of my talk is how you can be part of the solution. I'm really fortunate in my position at Xerces to be able to talk to audiences really around the world. Before the pandemic, of course, I traveled to give a lot of talks. Since the pandemic, with the help of Rachel and others, we've been able to reach a lot of people this way, which is really, really cool. So I'm really fortunate, but I have a lot of people to thank when I do this, because this takes heavy lifting to do this work. And I like to do that first so they don't get truncated at the end. So unfortunately, my slides are not moving. There we go. First and foremost, I want to thank my wife and kids. They both inspire and empower me to do this work. I do this really for the future. We really need to try to leave our house, the planet, in better shape for those that are coming after us. For some reason, my slides, there we go, are having a hard time, and I apologize for that. I want to also thank our 14,000 members that support us, as well as over 100 scientists that we work with from around the world, dozens of federal, state, and local agencies, hundreds of farmers that have worked with us on habitat projects, actually thousands now, over 50 companies that support our work, many private foundations, as well as tens of thousands of community scientists and everyday people. We cannot do this without your help. And with that, I do have to say we are a donor-supported organization. Without donors, we would not be able to do the work we do. So if this is something you're able to do, and after this talk you feel that this is an organization that you feel happy supporting, please consider that and go to our website and support today if you can. And then I also want to thank our staff. Xerces has grown a lot since I've come on. We had 4 staff in 2000, 20 years ago when I came on, and we now have nearly 55 staff. And these are the people out doing the hard work of conservation every day, working with our partners to protect, restore, and enhance habitats for insects and their allies. So there may be a few of you who don't know what the Zirsi Society is. And that's how it is pronounced, the Zirsi Society. We're named after the first butterfly known to go extinct due to humans, the Xerces blue butterfly. And Robert Michael Pyle, a noted author and lepidopterist, really felt that there should be an organization that focused on butterflies and their insect allies. And in 1971, actually 50 years ago, this coming December, Bob Pyle started the Xerces Society. And we work through a variety of platforms in a very holistic way to conserve the natural world. And first and foremost, we really believe that we have to understand the animals we're working to protect. You really cannot come up with valid, good conservation plans unless you understand the animal's life history, their ecologies, their threats. And so we work with landowners, we work with agencies to try to understand the animals so that then we can come up with strategies to protect them. We also crowdsource data through our community science efforts. There's never enough researchers out there to answer the many, many conservation questions we have. But now with the technologies we have, we can really get you involved, get everybody involved in collecting data through Bumblebee Watch, as well as our Bumblebee Atlases, our Monarch Thanksgiving counts, our Western Milkweed Mapper. I'm not going to have time to talk about our community science efforts today because I have a lot to cover. But if you're interested in this approach, please do go to our website and check out how you can be involved. We are kicking off a California Bumblebee Atlas right now, and you could be in at the ground floor on that if you're in California. But really, you can be involved no matter where you are in North America. We do a lot of education and outreach. To make change, we have to get information to people and get that information that's actionable so people can take action. We've reached over 150,000 people in my tenure at Xerces in trainings all over the world, and many, many, many more millions through media, publications, and our other approach. This was back when I was a little younger and I had more hair, put on a suit to go to Washington, D.C. to talk with our lawmakers about policies and regulations that protect our animals and in the end, protect the people of this planet as well. We feel that scientists should also be advocates because oftentimes, if you want a science-based approach, you really need to weigh in and make sure that our legislators and our regulators understand how best to move forward. But at the end of the day, it's really about how, the species we're trying to protect and the habitats that we're providing for them. And over the last 20 years, we've protected and restored over 2.5 million acres of rare acres of habitat for both rare and at-risk invertebrates, as well as for broad invertebrate groups. So today I'm going to talk about insect decline, what's going on, and what we can do about it. And I do want to give a shout out to some of our great science partners. I've written some papers recently with some colleagues, one of them called Declines in Insect Abundance and Diversity. We know enough to act now. Another, 8 simple actions that individuals can take to save insects from global declines. Check those out. They've got a lot of good information in them. There's also a really great whole issue from PNAS on global insect declines. So if you Google that, that's all open access, and there's a wealth of information on what's going on with declines in our insects. So I want to talk about importance. I want to talk about what evidence we have for decline. I want to talk about threats, but then, and some of that's going to probably depress you. But then I'm going to talk about solutions. So if you can hang with me while I get through, decline and threats, we'll get to what we can all do about this issue. So first, why care about these animals? Well, insects and allies represent the vast majority of described animal species on the planet. As you see by this pictogram, that beetle in the right corner depicts all insect species. And then if you look near the bottom, you've got crustaceans and mollusks, you've got annelids, which are worms or oligochaetes. And you can see that they make up the vast majority of species, them and you can see the tree, the plants there. And what's interesting about this is there are many invertebrate species that we've not yet discovered. So when you add what we likely don't know, this incredible species diversity goes way up. We likely have 7 million species of insects and other invertebrates on the planet. We know maybe about 1.4 million of them have been described, but there are many, many more that have not. Now, why does that matter? Well, when you have this diversity, it means that these insects and their allies fill niches in ecosystems in terrestrial, freshwater, aquatic, and marine ecosystems. So they're everywhere. They also are really the heavyweights of the animal world. This is a study from Costa Rica that found that invertebrates make up 90% of terrestrial biomass. That's the weight of animals, 90%. Now you might think, well, this is a rainforest, and so that, there's a lot of insects in rainforests. But this really holds true planet-wide. Sorry for all the colors and getting a little deep here, but this shows, these two pictograms show biomass. And you can see from the pictogram on the left that plants, even though their species diversity is not as high as insects and their allies, their biomass is much greater. 450 gigatons of carbon. Plants really are the fabric of the planet. But then when you look at the animal portion, if you move to the right, you can see that insects and their allies really make up the vast majority of biomass of animals. So I like to actually say that plants, native plants, which I'll be talking about, and insects together are really the fabric of the planet. We've been tearing that fabric, but we can knit that fabric back together, and that's what we're going to need to do. So why does the diversity and biomass matter? Well, it means that invertebrates are part of nearly every food chain. 96% of songbirds rear their young on invertebrates. Aquatic macroinvertebrates are vital for most fish species. And in the ocean, krill and other invertebrates are vital for the food web from the very bottom to the top. Think about salmon. Midges are really an important food source for juvenile salmon. So, things like fish, birds, but also large mammals really tend to rely on insects as well, in many cases anyway. Think of the brown bear. Two of their most important food sources are salmon and berries. Salmon, of course, need insects and other invertebrates to make it to the ocean and then back into streams and rivers where the bear can catch them. And they need berries, which are pollinated by insects. So you can really think about this grizzly bear being fully reliant on insects and other invertebrates. Insects are also really important for many other things. Invertebrates help decompose over 90% of plant, human, and animal waste. This audience likely knows the importance of pollination. 85% of flowering plants require an animal, 85%, and most of these are insects. And the dollar value of this is great. A very conservative estimate in a study done in 2006 by a colleague, Mace Vaughn, who runs the Pollinator program at Xerces, and John Losey at Cornell University, found that insects provide $57 billion a year, 70 billion in today's economy, into the United States economy alone. That's a huge number, and it's likely very conservative because it's built on just a few of their services. But unfortunately, insects are really in decline. And you're wondering why you're seeing this very cool car, at least in my mind. This is my car from when I grew up, or well, when I was a young adult, I should say. I lived in Nebraska, grew up in Omaha, but went to college out west. and I was driving in his car back and forth across Nebraska all the time. And I cleaned this car a lot because it would always be covered in insects after I drove across the state. And it was my pride and joy, so I cleaned it. And I will right now take a step back and say I do apologize for my role in the climate crisis. I now drive a much more fuel efficient car and I minimize my driving. But at the time, you know, that wasn't what I was thinking about. But insects were really a part of my daily life, from getting impinged on my car to seeing them at streetlights to seeing thousands of monarch butterflies across Nebraska. But something started to happen 20 years ago or so. And I really first noticed it when I went back to Nebraska in a much more fuel efficient car with my oldest daughter, who was young back then, and drove across the state and really just didn't have an insect on the windshield. And I emailed out to colleagues really around the world and asked, are you seeing something here that I'm seeing, which is we just seem to have less of these animals out in the environment? And it was interesting. I heard back from many scientists saying, yes, we think that we're seeing less insects as well. Now, we need to be careful. This is not data. This is not science. And you know, when we think about the past, we sometimes can have a cloudy vision of that. But what this did is lead to many scientists starting to look into this. And unfortunately, the more we looked, the more we found out there was a problem. In an increasing number of studies since then has really showed that insects are declining around the world. And this really has gotten the attention of many people because of pollinators. Study after study really does show that our pollinators are declining. Now, I do want to take a step back and mention honeybees. I'm not going to talk about honeybees today, really, and honeybees are not native to North America, and they're a managed animal. And I want to point out that there are actually more honeybees on the planet now than there were ever before. Now, we have a problem with beekeeping and with hives dying and with pollination of some crops that need a lot of honeybees, but this does not mean that honeybees are going to go extinct because we manage them. But unfortunately, many of our other pollinators might. Now, there are a lot of insects out there, as you saw, 1.3 million species identified and another 6 million maybe to identify. So it's hard to get a handle on insects generally. And sometimes it's easier to dial down to groups like bumblebees, which have around 57 species in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And Rich Hatfield and Serena Jepson from my staff, working with a team at IUCN, did an assessment for bumblebees of the Americas and found out that 28% of bumblebees are considered threatened in North America, 41% in Mesoamerica. Colleagues in Europe have found similar trends, with 23.5% of bumblebees threatened in Europe. And this is epitomized by the rusty patch bumblebee. This species has declined by 90%. You can see its former range, which is in that kind of drab white color, and its current range, which is in those yellow dots. This was the first bee in the continental US to be protected under the Endangered Species Act because of a petition by the Zirsi Society. Butterflies are another pretty well-studied group, and they've actually been studied longer than many of our bee groups. And study after study from Europe, from North America, but now starting from other parts of the world, are showing decline. You know, the UK has studied butterflies or monitored butterflies for 100 years, and really trends in butterfly species, in the majority of species, are downwards. A 10-year study showed 52% of butterfly species have declined in abundance at monitored sites. In Flanders, 19 of the original 64 indigenous species have been extirpated. And I think we all know the plight of the monarch butterfly. You know, the monarch butterfly is declining across the eastern states. It's declined by 80%. Studies in Mexico show that it still seems to be declining based on the data that came out of Mexico this winter. But in the West, we may be on the verge of seeing a collapse in the migratory population. It's declined by 99.9%. And we're starting to get even more data on long-term decline of some of these groups. Two really important studies came out, one in 2019 and one in 2021. And both show that butterfly species are declining year over year at an alarming rate. The study from Ohio in 2019 found that butterflies are declining at 2% a year, 33% reduction over a 21-year period. And writing in Science, Matt Forrester and colleagues found that the number of butterflies in the Western United States fell by more than 1.6% a year. So butterflies are declining really across North America at a really alarming rate. And this intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services that I was part of, it's a UN effort, really found that likely 40% of invertebrate pollinator species may be facing extinction in the coming years and decades. And that's really alarming to think about. Studies also, though, show that this is not just about pollinators. Abundance and biomass of aquatic species is declining in certain places. A study in the upper Midwest found that biomass declined by over 50% in mayfly species. The counter news and the good news is that in certain places we've been working to clean our rivers and to clean our water bodies. And in some places, we're actually seeing increases in abundance of insects as we do river restoration. And that's what I'm going to talk about, is that conservation actions do work. I'm going to get there. I got to get through the problem first. Tiger beetles. More than a third of tiger beetle species are likely sufficiently rare to be considered threatened or endangered in North America. And while there's a lot of variation, across time and space, there's so many different taxonomies, there's different ecologies. What's really struck me coming out of the PNAS article is that abundances frequently fall by around 1% to 2% where they are studied. So we really don't need to debate whether insects and their allies are in trouble. We need to debate how bad of trouble they might be in, and then we need to talk about solutions. Now, I've talked about species and species groups here, and we need to protect species. All species are worth protecting, but the current crisis really is much larger than that, and really rises to us losing key ecological functions. Food for animals like birds and fish, pollination, pest control, all of these can be affected by these declining insects. So what's going on? I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I think you all know. Despite the different animals that we're looking at, really the most influential factors are likely habitat loss. We build and we grow our crops in a way that excludes animals from these areas. And that's a direct loss of habitat. And that is not just terrestrial, but also in aquatic situations. but it's also habitat degradation. Oftentimes you'll lose habitat, and then right next door, you'll be doing something to the remaining habitat that is affecting populations, whether it's overgrazing or overmowing or invasive plants moving in or too much fire, conifer encroachment, off-road vehicles. All of these have an effect. So it's not just habitat loss, it's also habitat degradation. Pesticides are a key factor. Of course, use on farms it is a big issue, and so is mosquito management. There are data really showing that both of these are leading to declines in insects. But I don't like to just point my fingers at farmers or other managers, because some studies show that we are using more pesticides in our urban areas on an acre basis than we are in ag areas. And this is in the quest for the perfect lawn and the perfect rows. But I'll talk about this, we need to move away from our dependence on these chemicals. We also live in a global world, and we move animals around, and with them moves diseases. Bumblebees in particular are moved around the world, and there's compelling data to show this is leading to diseases of the wild bumblebees in those areas. Also, honeybees can transfer disease to wild bees, and putting thousands of honeybees on our wildlands, on our Forest Service and BLM areas is a real potential problem from a disease transfer to our wild species. Remember, honeybees are not going to go extinct, but many of our native pollinators might. And honeybees also compete with many of our native bees as well. So there's a real place for honeybees. We should be doing all we can to manage them so we have their pollinator service, but we shouldn't pit them against our wild species out there. We also move other insects around, and whether on purpose or on accident, and this has led to decline in many species. Just one example, the 9-spot lady beetle has been extirpated from large areas, likely from competition from 2 non-native lady beetles that were introduced for biological control. Interestingly, the 9-spot lady beetle is still the state insect of New York State, but it's likely extirpated from the state. Lights. Just like with everything else, we're maximizing the amount of light that's out there, and lights affect both moths and fireflies. Not going to get into a deep dive on fireflies, but we have a new conservation campaign. Go to our website and check out if you're interested in fireflies. We've got management guidance as well as outreach and education materials on site. And then climate. Climate exerts powerful effects on the distribution and abundance of the Earth's insect species. And new studies are suggesting that climate is a major driver in decline of wild bees as well as butterflies. And when you take it all together, Dave Wagner, who wrote the introduction to that PNAS issue, coined it death by 1,000 cuts. You can see the top of this is mostly climate related, but then we've got habitat loss, we've got invasive species, we've got pollution, we've got pesticides, and it's really another colleague of mine, Matt Forster, called it a circular firing squad. We're just seeming to do everything we can to harm our wildlife species. So now that you're thoroughly depressed, what should we do about this? I really do believe that we have solutions, and those have been borne out. There are studies out there that show if we provide habitat, native plant habitat, in the case of terrestrial areas, as well as aquatic vegetation, but also managing habitats for these animals, we can make a big difference. But we also need to be thinking about making that difference now and having it last into the future, because climate change is here and it is changing our systems in ways sometimes that we know and in ways sometimes we don't. But we need to try to think about climate change in all of our conservation activities. And really, if we hope to stem the losses of invertebrates and the services they provide, we also need to work at all levels, and we need to restore and enhance native plant habitat for these animals across all landscapes, from the wildlands to the farmlands to cities and towns and everywhere in between. We really need to be working holistically across multiple landscapes. And again, I might sound a little like a broken record, but I want to make sure that we think about freshwater aquatic systems as well. It's really vital that they are part of our conservation efforts if we hope to stem the decline in biological diversity. Now, there are definitely gaps in our understanding of climate change, but it's clear that insects need high quality habitat. We know that. We know that animals move across landscapes, and so having travel corridors or stepping stones is also vital for these animals to move just to find mates or to find habitat, but also to move in the face of climate change. And we also need to reduce stressors such as pesticides. Now, what is a nature-based climate solution, and why do we need to focus on that? Well, climate change and biodiversity, I really feel, is a win-win or a lose-lose. Biodiversity plays a really important role in climate mitigation and adaptation, thus making it a key contribution to our efforts on climate change. At the same time, meeting mitigation targets is essential to averse biodiversity loss. There was a paper that came out in 2018 that showed that even without habitat loss, if we hit our worst climate scenarios, insects could lose and be displaced out of half of the habitat they currently reside in. That's without habitat loss and degradation. So we really need to be focused on climate change as well as biodiversity. And I feel it's impossible to address biodiversity loss without addressing climate change. And I think it's equally hard to tackle climate change without addressing biodiversity loss. So it's really reciprocal. And these nature-based solutions can help us address both. We can reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to land use. We can capture and store carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We can improve resilience of ecosystems, helping plants and animals, including humans, communities adapt to climate change. Now, again, just focusing on nature-based climate solutions does not mean that we don't have to lower our overall carbon outputs. We have to do that, and we have to do both. And natural areas are really, I believe, the glue that holds all this together. And we really need to make sure that we're managing our natural areas in a thoughtful way. Vegetation management, restoration really should maximize the diversity of native plant resources. And where we've got grazing or fire management or mowing or invasive species removal, or even recreation, we can tailor those to minimize the impacts and to maximize the benefits to the plant and insect diversity. So really, really important. And I also want to point out the issue of management versus restoration. When when people started talking about pollinator conservation, I really felt early on there was a lot of this Johnny wildflower seed approach, right? Restore, 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 restore. At the same time we were trying to restore, I was watching degradation or outright habitat loss in adjacent areas. We really need to think about managing landscapes, because oftentimes managing what remains is much more efficacious and less expensive than restoring habitat. I'm not saying we don't need to restore habitat, because we do, but we should first look at the habitats that we have and make sure that they're managed in a thoughtful way. And Xerces really does that, whether it's fire, whether it's grazing, conifer encroachment, whether it's on ag lands such as grazing, private grazing lands, or national forest, BLM. We really are working with land managers to think about management options that are going to maximize diversity of insects and other invertebrates and the plants, which we feel is an important way to of course help birds and fish and the other animals. And a lot of our focus is in terrestrial environments and on pollinators, but we also work to address biodiversity goals in aquatic situations. One example is freshwater mussels, where Emily Blevins, who manages that program, working with Serena Jepson, who manages our endangered species program and our aquatic program, does assessments and training and technical assistance, and actually completed a climate refuge analysis for freshwater mussels, so we can identify some of the best places to do restoration and protection for these animals. So natural areas are vital. Cities and towns are also really important. We can't really achieve our goals without working in cities and towns. 80% of people live in cities and towns. And invertebrate conservation can happen really at any scale. Even beelawns, urban meadows can serve as important habitat for insects. Hundreds of cities have now worked with Xerces to step up, to ban or minimize the use of toxic insecticides, to do habitat projects, and cities more and more are taking on this challenge. As part of our work and to help partner with cities and towns, the Zirsi Society has Bee City USA that really can help cities take an approach that, although focused on pollinators, goes beyond that to helping habitat for beneficial insects. And we now have almost 250 cities and campuses as part of this network, which is really, really cool. And it is really impactful. In 2019, our Bee City and Campus Network completed over 876 pollinator habitat projects. And many of them are working in their communities to also reduce pesticide use. So really, really important effort that just continues to grow. We provide a lot of technical backing and education and outreach to our affiliates. And if you're interested in this, check out, just Google Bee City USA and you can find out more. It's also reaching a lot of people. Our Bee City and Bee Campus Network in 2019 reached over 800,000 people with a pollinator conservation message. And that's the start of how we get people to change what they're doing, is by reaching out broadly in many different communities, agricultural communities, towns and cities, natural area managers and others. And I really believe that this is an access to wildlife and natural areas issue. It's an equity issue. I grew up in Omaha. I'm the youngest of 10 kids. And, we didn't go on far-flung vacations, but I had an undeveloped spot about a block and a half from my house that when I was a little kid, I'd run down to every day and I'd find snakes under rocks and lizards and catch fireflies at night and butterflies by day. And I really do credit that with my love of nature. And we really do need to start and make sure that we bring nature into neighborhoods that don't have enough of it. Because even a bee and a butterfly and another insect is wildlife, and it is interacting with the natural world, which I think is so important for the future. Cities can also address the climate crisis while addressing biodiversity loss. We've launched an effort in Santa Fe called the Santa Fe Pollinator Trail to build connected climate smart pollinator habitat. We're working with dozens of partners on this. We've identified core habitat patches and corridors throughout the city, and are working to get plants to people so that we can really build on this network. And as part of this effort, we are working to prioritize habitat establishment in historically underserved communities. Really excited to announce that I've done a lot of work in the past with the city of Boulder, Colorado, and we're hopeful that we can launch a similar project there. So natural areas, cities, but what's in between cities and ag and natural areas and its roadsides? They crisscross this country. There are 10 million acres of roadsides. And if properly managed and restored, they can provide habitat for both rare and generalist pollinators, and provide corridors for their movement. Remember, we need to be actively thinking about that. And there are lots of opportunities to maximize vegetation diversity on roadsides by minimizing disturbance and through restoration. And we are working actively on policy levels on this with NRDC, another conservation organization, and Jeff Merkley, Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon, to hopefully add language to the infrastructure bill to incentivize habitat for restoration. We really need to get more funding for this type of work. But if we are going to solve this problem, we need to work in natural areas, we need to work in cities and towns, we need to work on roadsides, but we also need to work in agriculture. About 40% of the land on our planet is used in agriculture. And fence row to fence row farming, pesticides and chemical fertilizers, soil degradation, and the conversion of natural habitat to agriculture is a real problem as the population grows and as we're feeding more and more people. We really have to take a step back and figure out how can we minimize our current approach and replace it with more agroecology and regenerative farming and an approach that thinks about nature and thinks about the long-term benefit of these lands instead of the short-term returns that we might get from a very conventional agricultural approach. And this is where restoration is vital everywhere, but restoration is really a vital component of restoring habitat to farms. And there are many agricultural nature-based solutions. You know, a lot of times I think people think of nature-based solutions and they think trees. And trees are really important. And planting native trees where native trees used to be is really vital from a nature-based solution standpoint. But there are lots of other nature-based solutions as well that work with shrubs or forbs and that really will help us to both mitigate and to help our animals adapt. And we've got tons of options on farms. They're, you know, from hedgerows to cover crops, thinking about our soils. Xerces has a new program doing trainings on how to think about the insects and invertebrates that are in your soils and managing soils on farms. And we need to distribute these and do as much of this across the country. And Xerces really does that. We have staff across the country working with incredible farmers who want to make a difference on things like cover crops that can both improve soil fertility, increase yields, retain soil moisture, and mitigate the effects of drought. So these types of approaches really do work both for biodiversity and can be integrated into farming. Hedgerows. Hedgerows have been used in Europe for more than 1,000 years. Some really rare insects in Europe are now only found around hedgerows. And having shrubs along with trees and along with forbs is a really important part of our ag biodiversity approach, as well as our climate adaptation approach. And Xerces really has worked across the country. We've got incredible staff working, in California, in Montana. Again, it's not just pollinators. This is a conservation biocontrol project in dryland wheat. In Minnesota, across to New York. These projects are important, and there's proof of concept. We can work in ag to restore habitat, protect biodiversity, and produce food. But it isn't about flowers, and sometimes it worries me that people are all in on the flowers, but then when we start talking about having really high quality habitat, which means that it's protected from pesticides, that's where some people close off their ears. Because to solve the insect decline problem, to solve our biodiversity and climate crisis, we must make major strides to minimize the impact of both herbicides and insecticides in all landscapes. And many studies have shown that these pesticides are a leading threat, especially insecticides, to the conservation of insects. And these, unfortunately, pesticides move often well beyond field borders. The other thing you should know is that production and use of pesticides are also a significant source of greenhouse gases. So minimizing pesticides really will help biodiversity, but also help in our approach to the climate crisis. And these chemicals move, and that is really the biggest issue. Well, one of the biggest issues with these pesticides. Many of them are highly mobile. They can move into water and contaminate it. They can move with wind erosion. They can move with dust. Many of these new pesticides, as I'll talk about neonicotinoids, are highly persistent. They can leach. There's spray drift. The list goes on and on. And I know people have probably heard about neonicotinoids. These are highly toxic systemic insecticides that are really highly persistent and highly mobile. And they are likely a major driver of insect declines, and we do need to address them. But if we're going to tackle this issue in a meaningful way, we need to have a focus beyond neonics, moving to a truly ecologically based integrated pest management approach. We'll really protect climate change and help with biodiversity loss. And I do want to point out, we do have staff across the country embedded with the Natural Resource Conservation Service that works with farmers and can help with government programs for funding for these programs. And we also have our Be Better Certified program. Be Better Certified is the only third-party pollinator certification program globally at this point. And third party is really important. What a third party certification does, like USDA organic, is ensure a level playing field for farmers, for companies, and for consumers. If it's third party certified, whether it's Be Better Certified or USDA or organic, you know that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that it's done right. So hopefully one of these days you'll be in a store and see a product with Be Better certified on the label. Just very quickly, I want to run through how we can have a holistic approach to biodiversity loss. In this case, pollinators. And you know, pollinators are being impacted by climate change in a variety of ways. The changes in temperatures can affect their survival, their growth, their reproduction. It can force them to move and shift ranges. And it can change the timing of biological events, maybe disconnect the flowers from these insects. And it can also change plants. The quality, quantity, and diversity of plants can change with climate change. And these interactions can change. So we also need to think about climate change with all of the other drivers of insect decline. If you combine climate change and stressors such as pesticides, that can even have a larger impact on our pollinators. So as I mentioned, although there are gaps in the science, we do know how to move forward on these issues. And research does indicate that we can develop movement corridors that allow these animals to move across the landscape. And Xerces has been modeling how to do this approach in the Central Valley of California. And the modeling effort is underway, and we have more work to do on that, and we hope the next iteration of this model will be published in the coming months. But the goal is to look at the best corridors, looking at both natural habitat, restoration sites, and where high concentrations of pesticides might be found to put corridors in all landscapes, in ag, in urban, and in make sure that we're managing natural areas. So we've developed seed mixes and methods of habitat restoration and land management adapted to future climate scenarios. Because as I said, we need to be thinking about what is this landscape going to be like in a decade, in 2 decades, in 3 decades. It's a lot of work to do restoration. We need to make sure that it's here to stay. And in the past decade, we've worked with partners to restore over 50 miles of hedgerows across California. And many of our projects are in areas where there are little or no other habitat, making them vital if we hope to bring biodiversity back into these landscapes. This picture may be hard to see, but in the foreground there, you can see a speck of white, and that's a pretty large pickup truck. A very large, just planted hedgerow in the San Joaquin Valley. So our goal is to go from this to this. And that's in our ag, but we really need to make sure that we're also working in towns and cities. And as part of this, we've worked in Sacramento and other communities to get plants, pollinator plants, in the hands of community groups so that we can make sure we're restoring areas throughout these towns and cities. And we're also working with land managers to ensure that we're promoting climate resilient wildlife refuges and wildlands. Really, the goal is to connect all these habitats to the natural areas as hubs of pollinator diversity. And then very, very quickly, I'm just going to say that it's not all about us individually. We need governments to step up. You know, we work with incredible farmers. We work with incredible volunteers in cities and in towns. We work with incredible roadside managers and natural area managers. But our governments really do need to step up to prove, you know, we really need better policies that promote, preserve, and restore habitat for both vulnerable species as well as species generally. to reduce pesticides, and to address climate change. And we need to do a better job of funding really important laws like the Endangered Species Act. It's the emergency room approach to insect conservation, but it is a really important approach. And we know that when it is applied, it works. By the way, this is the Delhi Sands flower-loving fly. It's just what a cool insect. We also need to think about the Farm Bill, which is coming up in a few years, and making sure we let our elected officials know that we need to make sure that the Farm Bill both is equitable from a human point of view, but also promotes biodiversity broadly and promotes climate solutions. And that's something that all of us can weigh into over the next few years. Xerces is also focused on state action to help invertebrates. You know, it's unbelievable in 2021, but many states cannot protect insects or other invertebrates because of the way certain state laws are written. By the way, I love this picture. It looks like this animal's just getting ready to come out and kiss you. This is the Malone's jumping slug. And it lives in old growth forests in Oregon. Oregon is one of the states actually that at the state level, they cannot protect insects or other invertebrates. And I did say jumping. This slug actually has evolved to get away from one of its main predators, which is a large land snail. And if the land snail gets up to it, the land snail actually follows its slime trail, this other predatory snail. And when it gets up to it, it will bite the back end of this slug. And the slug basically jumps, not very far, but it corkscrews away and leaves its slime trail behind and can get away from this predator. Beyond being incredibly important, these animals are just so incredibly cool. And I encourage you to go deep and look at how neat some of these animals are. California is another state that recently, because of a lawsuit, insects cannot be protected under the California Endangered Species Act. Can you imagine a law that is written to protect wildlife that can't protect 75% of the wildlife in the state? It's really a problem that needs to be addressed. So just very end, one thing that I wanted to make sure that I pointed out is that Xerces really cannot do this without all of your help. Partnerships are key. Xerces has grown a lot in the last 20 years, but this is a monumental task. And our partnerships with land managers, researchers, nonprofits, neighbors really pays off. And coordination and communication really are keys to this success. So hopefully we can work with many of you in the future who are listening today. We also need, if we hope to conserve biodiversity and address the climate crisis, we need to make sure all people are actively seen and engaged as part of that solution. The conservation community, and I'm pointing a finger at Xerces as well, Xerces included, has a lot more work to do to grow inclusivity so that BIPOC communities and all communities can feel welcome in our work. We also all must practice reciprocity to ensure we are showing up for our partners and expanding our partnerships equitably. It's really, really important, both on a human level and to get the job done that we do this. And really all people have a role, whether you're out protecting habitat or growing a garden or not, you can become part of the solution Today, we've got go to our website where we're getting people to ask their nurseries if the plants they buy are bee safe. But you can become a community scientist. You can use your pocketbook, if you're able, to support organic and sustainable agriculture. You can curb your carbon footprint by eating less meat, by eliminating uneven travel, and in many other ways. And you can support candidates that care about science and conservation. And the good news is, and it really is good news, is that there is hope, because insects are really resilient. And we have established methods of conservation. We know that if you do certain things or don't do other things, that we can have more diversity and abundance of insects and other invertebrates out on the landscape. And we can do it in reasonable time frames, but we must do it. We must act. With that, I just wanted to point out we have a lot of resources on our website. Please go there. Many of them are free. You can download them. And we also have many books that you can get at our gift center that may be helpful. And with that, thank you for taking an hour out of your day to listen. And I hope that this has helped to give you some ideas on how you can move forward to be part of the solution. So thank you much.
Thank you so much, Scott. We have a lot of really good questions. And just so folks know, if you can use the Q&A icon to ask any questions, that would be really helpful just organizationally. But we're getting lots of good comments, and I'm going to kick us off with this question, which I really appreciate. Caitlin plans to attend graduate school in the next year and wants to focus her thesis on insect declines in some capacity. What do you feel are the most urgent research areas that need addressed? And do you have any advice for future conservation scientists?
I do. One, I'm glad you're thinking about it now. And I think that there are so many questions that still need to be answered. But from my practical point of view, what we need to understand more, what we still need to understand is not whether insects are declining, although those are useful studies. But what are the drivers? What are the real drivers of insect declines in certain situations and for certain insect groups? And if we can understand the drivers, what are the methods for minimizing the impact of those drivers? So from a graduate program, if we can better understand what conservation practitioners can do to maximize our conservation science approach, I think that those are questions that still definitely need to be answered. I would also say that as you're getting into this, try to not be too focused. And I know sometimes graduate school can focus us because we have to have a dissertation or a thesis. But if you're hoping to go out in the world and actually make change, think about the nexus between your science and outreach and education, the nexus between your science and restoration, the nexus between your science and empowering all communities to weigh in and help us do this work. That's what I would say, and I know you have to have a certain focus. But if you can be in your education, if you can be as broad as possible, I think that'll help you in the future.
All right, next question. John is wondering, how do you know there are so many undiscovered species?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, an estimate based on what we know. So when people are out doing surveys and you go to the rainforest where probably the majority of our undiscovered species are found, and you can go to any acre and find many new species. And so that conservative estimate of 6.7 million is really based on that. But that number is likely going down every year because we're losing those acres. We're losing acres of rainforests to ag. We're losing acres of prairie habitats that have high diversity to, to a variety of anthropogenic impacts. So, but that's how we know. Basically, it is an estimate. So I don't want to say we know, but that is a very conservative estimate based on surveys that have been done across the world to look at invertebrate diversity.
So Kathy is just wondering if you can clarify what you mean by insect allies.
So when I say insect allies, it's really the other invertebrates. It is crustaceans, it is mollusks, but it's also, spiders, and it's earthworms. There are many types of invertebrates out there. And I often talk with insects and invertebrates, or insects and their allies, because I think we're still getting used to, at least the general public, to this term invertebrate. And but I think with a lot of the popular media now talking about insects and insect decline, we can use that as a way to start broadening the conversation, because it's not just insects in decline. Freshwater mussels are declining as a group more than any other animal on the planet. Crustaceans are also declining at an alarming rate. So, oftentimes when you see a headline, insect apocalypse, it doesn't tell the whole story, that this is broader than just the insect group.
Thank you, Scott. Philip has 100 acres and is managing an old field habitat for grassland birds, and they are wondering where they can find information on compatible management options for insects, and they do have a problem with adjacent farms using neonics.
Yeah, well, reach out. What I would do is go to our website. I'd reach out probably first to our Pollinator program, the Pollinator program email. We have staff around the country that can certainly talk to you about these issues. And the working on insect conservation and bird conservation is as compatible as you can get. So there are lots of strategies to maximize both insects and birds. And there are some strategies that you can use to minimize the impact of what your neighbors are doing. So what I would do is reach out to actually pollinators at xerces.org, might be pollinator, or go to our website, find that email. And if you can't find that email, you can reach out generally and we'll connect you with the right people to chat with. So excellent. I'm glad. Thank you for what you're doing.
I did put that email in the chat box, so everyone should have access to that. Another interesting question, is there a possibility that roadside habitat does more harm than good because of the residue coming from vehicles?
That's a great question. So I get two questions on roadsides. One, the residue coming from vehicles, and two, the issue of roadkill. So I think I'll address both of them. They both are real issues. And actually, there's a study that after years showed that salmon in creeks in Washington state are being impacted by some of the products that are actually in the tires of cars that then get washed into these streams. So that took a decade or more to understand why salmon weren't doing well in some of these habitats. So we still have a lot to learn. And for aquatic situations, roads and the materials that come off of roads can really be significant. In terrestrial situations where you've got flowering habitat adjacent to roads, there doesn't seem to be as much of an impact on the flower visitors from the roadside chemicals. And this is not to say that we don't need to deal with roadside chemicals, but we can have good quality habitat and adjacent to the roads. The other issue is with roadkill. There's for resident insects, this is not for migratory insects, which as they're traveling broadly might get hit at any time on a roadside. But for resident insects, having high quality native plant habitat seems to actually minimize roadkill along those roads. And it makes perfect ecological sense when you think about it. These animals are not traveling any farther than they need to get to the resource that they need. So if you've got a weedy or sparsely vegetated roadside, you know, a bee or a butterfly may be traveling a long way to get the pollen and nectar that it needs. But if you have a really good intact native planting, they're flying less. So they're less likely to go out in the road and be hit. But these are really important questions. If you go onto our website and you go under the pollinator program, we've got a whole section on roadsides, roadside management, roadside restoration, and there's a lot of a lot of documents there, a lot of information there that I think can give you a deeper dive if you're interested.
A lot of people are asking about this webinar specifically, and if it's going to be recorded, it will be, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search the Xerces Society. We have an awesome channel. All of our webinars are on there, and this specifically will be uploaded by the end of today. There are quite a few questions, Scott, about why states are forbidding insect protecting legislation, which is a very complicated and interesting question. I thought I'd throw it at you.
Well, it's a lot of it is a legacy of the past. When many wildlife agencies were created, you know, in the 1960s, potentially maybe before then, insects and invertebrates were often not thought of as wildlife. So you had a wildlife agency that was given the task of protecting wildlife, which was, you know, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, fish, oftentimes. And that's where a lot of this comes from, is in the past, people were not thinking about insects. And it's why Robert Michael Pyle founded the Zirsi Society, because he knew back in 1971 that people were not thinking of insects as wildlife. So that's one of the main reasons why. But so what we need to do in this day and age of pollinator decline and insect and apocalypse is to really try to take a step back and work with states to really update these antiquated laws and to make sure that insects are part of their portfolio. Specifically in California, really unfortunate is the state of California and the Xerces Society feel that the state can protect insects currently under their endangered species statute. Unfortunately, and they were poised to protect 4 bumblebee species that are, you know, some of them on the brink of extinction. And unfortunately, some very large agricultural interests sued the state to block the insects being protected. And a judge agreed with the plaintiffs that insects should not be able to be protected under that law. The state, as well as the Zirsi Society and our partners, have appealed that decision. And so we really hope that in further review, we'll be able to to really move forward and protect wildlife. Wildlife is not just birds, bees, mammals, or sorry, not just birds, fish, mammals, and amphibians and reptiles. It's really not. And the more we can do to speak out about these issues and to let our local state legislators know that insects are really important and that the state should be focused on conservation, not just of large megafauna, but also of this incredibly important, these incredibly important smaller animals. That's important because the more they hear from people, the more likely when something comes up that they can change these laws, that they'll be more willing to do so. So your voices out there, letting folks know that insects are an important part of the picture, that is so important.
All right, so many good questions. Someone specifically is asking about climate smart habitat. Does this mainly pertain to drought tolerant native plants? What are some other main variables to consider?
Yes, drought tolerant is a really important factor when you're thinking about climate smart plantings, especially if you're in, the arid West, California. But, if you live on the Eastern Seaboard, maybe you need to think about plants that can withstand real, the changes that we're seeing in our climate. Several years ago, I was talking to a colleague who worked in the Hudson Valley, and within a 1 decade stretch, they saw the driest year on record, they saw the wettest year on record, and they had 2 hurricanes. They were doing restoration. We need to think about wherever we are, what is the future likely to hold? And can we maximize plant communities that can withstand these changes? And diversity in itself is a real powerful tool, because the more diverse the systems are, both our plant systems as well as our insects and other invertebrates, as well as birds and everything else, the more likely species groups are going to be able to, some species may do well under wetter years, some species may do well under drier years, or late snows, or early freezes, all the things we're going to see. So that diversity is really important as part of this. So it's not just drought tolerance, although I think that's a really important factor. It's thinking about the changes that might happen in your local climate and what are going to be the best native plants that you can use to stand the test of time. And I do want to go back to native plants because I didn't get a chance to talk a huge amount about native plants, although I mentioned them a couple times. Native plants have really been shown to support the highest number and greatest diversity of insects out there. It doesn't mean that, so we should really double down on planting native plants, locally native plants where possible. It doesn't mean that only native plants, cover crop systems, for instance, or in your yard, you may have a lot of native plants, but I'm looking out at my yard and I've got non-native vegetables and fruit plants that would have never grown here in Oregon. So my yard isn't 100% native, but having that good diversity of plants, focusing on natives, thinking about climate, whether it's going to be long-term drought or really just changes in your weather systems that are coming. That's the focus, and then diversity.
Right. We had someone email in this question, and then another person is also asking, what is your opinion on people raising monarchs in cages on a small scale? Can it help increase the numbers of individuals in a season? They have a lot of milkweed in their yard, but there are so many predators that they are afraid that they will eat the eggs.
Yeah, this is a complex issue of raising animals for conservation. And when you think about monarchs, monarchs are raised for a variety of reasons. There's a whole industry out there raising monarchs to release en masse, at weddings and at other events. And this is really problematic from a monarch point of view. And the Zirsi Society really feels that we should not be releasing monarchs for those purposes. So that's the hard no. If you've got a backyard and you've got some milkweed and you have a few monarchs and you want to help them along, or you want to raise a few to educate the public about monarchs, that is a different story. But the verdict is still out from an education point of view. If you're doing education and you're showing people why monarchs are important and cool, and you're really doing it on a very small scale, that definitely is a positive. We don't know from a conservation point of view whether raising monarchs is really helpful. And one of the things that has come out is that when you raise animals, you may be raising animals that are a little less fit than the populations out in the wild. There are reasons why certain monarchs or certain animals living in the wild don't make it. And oftentimes it's the weaker animals that are getting quote unquote cold out of the system. You end up with stronger animals that can migrate farther, that really can have potentially more babies when they mate. So the verdict is still out on whether on a small scale you're helping on conservation. And I don't think there's data to truly support that you're helping on conservation. On the other hand, from an education point of view, and from a, living in this world point of view, if you're taking 10 monarchs and raising them in cages outside, and that is key, there is data to show that that raising monarchs inside can potentially change their physiology. But if you're raising them in cages outside, I don't see a huge downside, but we don't know of a huge upside from it either. What we need to do with monarchs, and what is much more important than raising a few monarchs, is in your own life providing habitat, ensuring that pesticides, especially insecticides, are not used anywhere near your habitat, working with your parks department to put in habitat or to ensure that they aren't poisoning habitat that's out there, telling your neighbors, we need to successfully conserve monarchs. We aren't going to raise our way out of this crisis. And we have to fix the root causes. And raising monarchs just masks that, right? We can release some monarchs this year, but if really they don't have any place to go that is fairly pesticide free and that has good resources for them to move across the landscape, to find nectar, to find egg laying sites, this isn't going to work. So sorry, that's a little long and it's a little complicated, but if you want to do anything for pollinators, the same goes for raising honeybees. Honeybees are really cool and they can produce delicious honey, but honeybee keeping is not conservation. If you want to conserve pollinators, we need habitat, we need to deal with pesticides. Those are two of the main issues, and we need to amplify the voices of people out there so that we can get more and more and more people putting in habitat and protecting it from pesticides. That's the key.
So I think we have time for just one or two more questions. We have a lot of people asking questions about how do you talk to your neighbors or landscaping companies or your city about using pesticides or putting in native habitat? How do you even approach someone in a conversation like that, even with your neighborhood? Do you have any general advice for folks? I think this is probably a barrier for people.
Yeah, I do have advice because I do it all the time. And actually, if you go to our website, there's a wonderful blog by Sharon on our staff, who's part of our pesticide program. Sometimes pesticide issues are some of the hardest to talk about. And it's a great blog about just having conversations and starting conversations and asking questions, right? The way I do it, I think I'm a pretty respectful guy. Going in with sometimes I see things that I just shake my head, and kind of they get my hackles up. I take a deep breath. I don't go into these confrontationally. I go in often asking questions and finding out what people are doing and why they're doing it, and trying to ease into having these conversations. I also try to lead by example. Our habitat signs are a great way to start talking to your neighbors about these issues. People come up and go, "Oh, what is pollinator habitat? Oh, I see your yard. It tends to have all these bumblebees and butterflies and birds," and you can start talking to them from your space and why you do it and why we should all be doing it. So I think it's so variable, these conversations that we have, but starting with respect, starting with trying to understand why people are doing what they're doing, and then coming in with some facts. Don't lead with facts. Stories are much better than facts. But if people want the facts, we've got those on our website. You can print. You can print them up. You can give people our fact sheets. We've got our Bring Back the Pollinators fact sheet that you can give people. And but just start to have the conversations. I think it's important. From a neighborhood association, we've got content on our website that certainly you could crib from if you wanted to give a presentation to your neighborhood association on why this is important and why the neighborhood association should care. We also have volunteers. We've got a incredible group of volunteers called our Xercis Ambassadors that may be in your communities that could help talk to a neighborhood association, come in and provide some of that education. So go have the conversations, look at our website for resources, and really ask questions, because that's a great way to find out what people are doing, and then be able to discuss how they might have just as good of an outcome by changing the way they work.